literature, there are basically two ways to write a book. The first one is starting from a general idea. You create the world, you create the characters, and you develop that idea together with them. That way, the story flows naturally and stays coherent. The second one is starting from one specific scene that you have stuck in your head, that scene you've been turning over in your mind for months or even years, and then you build the entire world and every single character just so that scene can come to life. And look, this second one approach is usually the worst, because you force everything to converge on that one moment you are so obsessed with. And the result is almost always the same. Plot holes, events that don't connect, characters who have no reason to be there, narrative breaches that lead nowhere, and a mediocre story. Everything gets sacrificed on the altar of that particular scene. Well, Nolan's The Odyssey is exactly that. A series of events that may or may not be related to each other, with characters that may or may not belong in this story, and with a mixed bag of races that, let's be honest, have no business being in a movie that claims to be based, and I stress the word based, not inspired by, on one of the greatest stories of the ancient world. Hello dear viewers and welcome back. My name is Amilcar, I'm a sci-fi and dark fantasy author, and this is 4 Cents. Okay, first of all, I want to apologize for the lack of videos last week and at the beginning of this one. I had to undergo surgery and I was recovering. That said, let's get started. Nolan's The Odyssey. The movie that looks more like a Benetton commercial than a work about ancient Greece. A film that, if it didn't have the name of one of the most respected directors of our time attached to it, would have been an absolute flop. This movie supposedly tells the story of Odysseus' journey to return to Ithaca after the Trojan War. Events that in part connect with the Iliad and other poems by Homer, and that have inspired a ton of movies about Troy, plus lost poems like the Little Iliad or the Iliupersis, but with some important differences. When Christopher Nolan talks about the Odyssey, in several interviews he refers to the translation by Emily Wilson, a version done by a feminist who reads the poem through purple-tinted glasses, and that a lot of people consider more a fanfic than a faithful transcription. Why? Because she changed and added things to the original. That's why. And that's not all. The movie also throws in elements from another poem that isn't by Homer at all, but a Roman reinvention written centuries later, Virgil's Aeneid, but we'll talk about that later. Just like Nolan's own statements, it's a collection of contradictions right from its core structure. And I'm explaining this because it's key to understand why this film, beyond the very obvious politically motivated casting, is a structural disaster. On one hand, Nolan says he wasn't going to use an orchestral score because back then the Greeks didn't have orchestras. Fine, I get it. But at the same time, he fills the screen with races and multiculturalism that has nothing to do with the era. And this keeps repeating itself over and over from back to back and from back to front. The movie feels like it's set in today's Greece, yet they refuse to use modern music. All the buildings are ruins, the same ones you see when you go sightseeing in Greece. The problem is that in ancient times, those same buildings weren't ruins. They were wonders of civilization, works of art disguised as architecture. Nolan seems to forget that something old wasn't always old, that everything was new once, and that people, as at least in the ancient Greece of the epic, didn't live in ruins. About the casting, like I already said, clear political agenda. Odysseus' crew looks like the first United Nations. That's why scenes like the one where an Indian guy and a black guy tell someone on the beach we are grips from Ithaca feel so ridiculously disconnected from historical reality. And beyond that problem, which isn't small, we have the actors themselves. And I normally never do this, but I'm going to criticize their physical presence because I think it's important to understand or to see the big picture. I don't know if you ever seen a real soldier with his arms uncovered, because Odysseus' crew and about 90% of the cast looked nothing like that. And this is where Hugh Jackman makes the difference. Even though he's quite a bit older than almost the entire cast of this movie, for Wolverine he actually prepared properly. Gym, muscle mass that match the character, etc. Here, it was the complete opposite. In most cases, you had guys who, while they didn't look sedentary, looked like people who go to the gym 3 times a week for an hour just to stay healthy. Something that has nothing to do with a warrior of that era, who basically lived to eat, sleep, and train. Nolan simply doesn't trust that the viewer is capable of projecting themselves into a different time period. He treats them like idiots who need the past translated into present day parameters, race included and realistic 3 times a week gym muscles. As someone said out there, the movie is pretentious, and I truly believe it. And regarding the performances in general, they basically didn't exist. I agree with a lot of people. Several actors just played themselves or characters from other movies. Matt Damon was Matt Damon from start to finish. He wasn't that clever, narcissistic, and ingenious Odysseus we know. The guy who knew how sharp he was and therefore believed he could get out of any problem cleanly, which makes his time with Calypso hard so much more in the original. Here, you never saw that cunning in his eyes. You never hear that sharp tone. It was just Matt Damon, serious, analytical, almost introverted. A veteran with PTSD going on a 10 years adventure. With Tom Holland and Telemachus, it's exactly the same, only he's playing Peter Parker, not the son of the king of Ithaca. And the script confirms it because it's full of modern language that strips the movie out of everything epic. On top of that, there are scenes where Telemachus should have died, but since the script needed him alive, he walked away without a scratch. I can't say much about Lupita Nyong'o because her screen time was so short they had to give her 2 roles just so she could reach the minute quota Hollywood demands if you want to be in the running for an Oscar. Her entire part was nothing more than an excuse to present Menelaus, the king of Sparta, as a Greek version of Andrew Tate. Seriously, when I saw the character in the first scene before he even opened his mouth, I thought it was him, Andrew Tate. And the worst part is that his lines, the way he treats Helen, and that malicious suggestion that he disfigured her as a punishment because of his abusive nature, only made that image stronger. And then we get to Elliot Page, the woman who transitioned into a boy because, unfortunately for him, his body still looks like that of a teenager, at least in appearance. The scene where he runs along the beach in Greek armor was ridiculous. So much so that the movie accidentally ended up looking 90% like the famous meme. And that's exactly what the character is, a meme taken from another work. Yes, from the Aeneid, written 6.5 centuries after the Odyssey by a Roman writer. They put him in simply to give him enough screen time to fight for the Best Supporting Actor Oscar without Troy burning, no pun intended. Now, not every performance was a disaster. Some just felt disconnected, like Anne Hathaway. Some people say she overacted, and I disagree. She gave her character the emotion it needed when it needed it. The problem is that the acting from almost the rest of the cast was so flat and sterile that next to them she looked exaggerated. And the one who was in perfect balance, by far, was Robert Pattinson as Antinous. About his work, I don't have much more to say. It was, without a doubt, one of the best in the entire movie. Now, about the events themselves. The movie runs with that very particular Nolan style. Time jumps, flashbacks inside flashbacks, and not just vertical jumps but horizontal ones too. It runs 4 or 5 timelines at the same time, which forces the viewer to pay absolute attention if they don't want to completely lose the thread. That said, the character of Calypso was changed so much that she stopped being Calypso and became the typical female character number 10. In the original work, Odysseus is trapped on her island for 7 years. She's the one who won't let him leave because she fell in love with him and wants to make him her lover for eternity. And Odysseus every night sits looking out at the ocean and cries. He's a victim, and that's why that episode is so powerful in the poem. All his cunning, the entire way he had lived up to that point, crashes head-on into that suffering. Those 7 years feel like a punishment from the gods for his past actions. And in Nolan's movie, there is no one of that. On the other hand, the pig scene. That one was next level. It's exactly the kind of sequence I personally hope to see in something like Clayface. It was grotesque, malicious, cruel, and sadistic, and I love it. As a former Vampire the Masquerade player, it reminded me a lot of the Chimis with vicissitude, that power to permanently and horrifically alter the bodies of their victims. For me, it hit harder because of that memory, and that's why I was so fascinated with it. Unfortunately, that same scene ended up contrasting with what a lot of people might call the perfect representation of modern feminism. Circe doesn't punish the crew for something they did, she punishes them for something she believes they could do. Not for being warriors, not for being soldiers, not for being Greek, but for being men. And yes, some interpreted that the character was abused in the past, but many forget one detail. She turned her own sister into a crow because, in her words, they get along better that way. In other words, she creates a fiction inside her head and uses her powers to reshape the world around that fiction, no matter how cruel it is for everyone else. Like I said before, Nolan treats his audience like idiots. And that's why another of the big criticisms, and I completely agree, is that the Greek ships were Viking ships. You don't need to be an historian to notice it. A quick internet search confirms it instantly. The same goes for the armor designs. Second worst thing in the entire movie. The helmets actually blocked the vision of the extras. They weren't just aesthetically horrible, they weren't functional at all. I swear, I genuinely don't understand what Nolan was trying to represent with those designs. And let's not even talk about the amount of steel that appears in the middle of the Bronze Age. And finally, the fight choreography. For years now, Hollywood has been repeating the same thing, the same error. Fights that look more like contemporary dance than a real fight, or at least a well executed one. The combats were pathetic. Punches in the air, fan-like movements that only serve to distract the opponent while someone else stabbed them on the chest, grabs, throws, maneuvers you expect to see in a low-budget independent film or, I don't know, in Bollywood. Not in a super production of this scale. And on top of that, characters like Tom Holland or Matt Damon get run through, impaled, shot full of arrows in the back and in the ribs, and they ended up with nothing more than a quick bandage around the neck. Especially that scene in the banquet hall, Odysseus surrounded by enemies armed to the teeth, treating them with an arrow? Not with a bow and an arrow, with a single loose arrow, while the others have spears and swords. It was simply pathetic. And I want to be very emphatic about this. If Christopher Nolan's name wasn't attached to this production, I seriously doubt that the movie would have been even reached 1 or 200 million at the box office. In conclusion, this movie is more of the same thing Hollywood has been doing for the last several years. A checklist designed to win awards handed out by the same people who makes the movies. Aimed at a clear, whose acceptance speech do I want to hear this year? They forgot that the roots of entertainment are not about indoctrinating a population they consider ignorant. They are about entertaining an audience, and the applause of that audience should be the greatest and most important award of all. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like, subscribe and share with others. I love to read your thoughts in the comments. Did you watch Nolan's The Odyssey? If you did, what was the one thing that bothered you the most? Do you think big directors like Nolan are getting a free pass these days just because of their name, even when the final product doesn't respect the source material? Once again, thank you so much for watching. My name is Amilcar and I'll see you in the next 4 Cents video. Bye bye.